presentation is really simply a discussion about hoarding therapy. So I don't have any PowerPoint tonight because I want this to be a free-flowing discussion. And the leadership team, you're more than welcome to pull an audible and do kind of more of a interview style if you'd like to kind of pepper that in if you're interested in doing that. But, you know, just to kind of start off with, I thought I would kind of say, like kind of what got me interested in helping people with hoarding conditions. And it really started all the way back in 2009 in my practicum with Dr. Vern Devine. I was basically one of his students. He was doing the therapy in office, and we, as his students, were providing supplemental therapeutic therapy in the home for the people that we were serving. And some of those people that I served were people with hoarding conditions. I did a lot of exposure therapy also for people with anxiety. I was the guy in the car when the person was having a panic attack behind the wheel, kind of coaching them through that. And then with the hoarding, that's when I got first exposed to helping people with that condition. And basically, the thing that I liked about it was that, you really got to see a lot of tangible progress, versus other types of conditions, and very visual in terms of the progress, in addition to the reports that you get from the clients that you're serving. I found it to be, exciting, a positive challenge, and it's something that I've done, as Michelle gave you the summary on, in various capacities. So that's kind of the gist of, like, how I got into this. So the first thing I wanted to do is just kind of talk about, what is an appropriate referral for therapy, or what makes a person just in general a good fit for therapy. We get this question a lot. I get this question a lot. So a lot of times what will happen, and I've seen this through the hoarding task force, given my experience with this organization, is that a family member, they'll call in or they'll be part of the call, and they are basically, wondering if we as a therapist can help their loved one. And a lot of times, when a family member calls on behalf of the potential client, sometimes I can find that to be a red flag. And then the reason being is that many times when that happens, the actual person who has the challenge is not wanting the therapy. So therapy is one of those services where we as the therapist act as guides to the change, but we cannot make the change. So if you have like a loved one who's in danger of eviction, you're probably pretty far down the line in terms of the severity of it. It doesn't mean that we can't help at all. Though at that point, you're talking about kind of more emergency services, emergency cleanups. Maybe the local county might give a dumpster if they have that type of funding. But basically, in order for therapy to work, really the assessed need by whoever it is, the professional, the family, must really match the client wanting the service. So there can be all the need in the world for therapy, but if the person that is dealing with the challenge doesn't want the therapy for hoarding, it's not going to be successful. So if you have a loved one who's really resistant, really it's best for them to call and make the appointment for therapy. And when you talk about the stages of change when it comes to this dynamic, there's really 5 stages of change. One of them is pre-contemplation. Another one is contemplation. And then what we have is, we call it preparation. And then we got the stage of action. And then when you get to the point where you're like, wow, I'm doing really good, don't need therapy anymore, then we get to maintenance. So when you just kind of cold call on behalf of a family member and think that they need the help, again, they probably do need the help. there's a good likelihood that they're probably in pre-contemplation. Like they may not even see that it's a problem. So those people are not going to be the greatest candidates for therapy. Now, people in contemplation, they're not going to be the best either because, they're not quite ready. They're kind of like, I don't know. They're kind of weighing the pros and the cons. But really, you want somebody who's in preparation or action phase for therapy to be effective. So the reason also is that it's a lot of work for therapy. You got to do a lot of things for therapy to be successful. And I'll get into a little bit more of that a little later here. Though, does anybody have any questions up to this point? Any comments, concerns? Okay. So let me tell you kind of how the therapy process works. So I think a lot of people who are new to therapy just kind of think, oh yeah, I'll be able to start working on stuff from the first session. Um, a lot of times that's not going to be the case. And here's the reason why. Just in terms of the world of managed care with insurance companies and whatnot, and just the regulations that are out there with the Department of Human Services, we as therapists are basically required to do what we call a diagnostic assessment on the first session. So what we do in this session is we do a lot of informational gathering. So we'll ask the client, like a lot of questions about their mental health symptoms. In the case of somebody with a potential hoarding condition, we would ask them about that. We would also ask a little bit about their background, their social history to kind of gather other things that are pertinent and important to them, particularly any particular potential for trauma background. And so a lot of the first session is going to be a lot of informational gathering. So, like when you go into therapy, and you're seeing your therapist for the first time, don't expect the first session to be the most therapeutic, because what happens is that typically the real therapy, the normal therapy session, starts on session 2. And then session 2, we typically do like a goal plan that takes about 10 minutes. And then for the remainder of the time, we do therapy. And then from then on out, we're doing therapy, about once a week in the beginning, typically, particularly for hoarding and a lot of other conditions. And then once the person is doing better, we would drop down to once every 2 weeks. And then when the person is ready to graduate from therapy, we typically would schedule out the last session by around a month or so before closing them. And then a typical, what we call clinical hour is going to be around 53 minutes or so. Anybody have any questions about that whole process in terms of like the beginning stages of therapy, or any comments or concerns?
I'm actually curious, once they can get to that maintenance phase, how
Yeah.
often do you see that be successful? Do they go back to an action phase again? Do they waiver, or, is maintenance kind of a remission sort of phase?
It's a good question, Michelle. I mean, it can be either or. I mean, actually, with the stages of change, people can kind of go back and forth, actually. Ideally, maintenance means that, there's a sustained period of what you would call remission from the problem, or they have the issue managed well. So that's what maintenance means. But by all means, yes, somebody could go backwards in their progress and go back to their ways. And then they might go back to action or preparation, or even all the way back to pre-contemplation. So that's a good question. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. So now that we kind of have like the framework for what happens in the beginning sessions of therapy, let me just kind of give you the gist of what the therapy entails. And before I even go into that, I'm going to talk about just a little bit of the diagnostic features of hoarding. So one of the primary ones really is an emotional attachment to the items. And secondly, they find it emotionally difficult to get rid of the items. So it's not good enough that the person has like a bunch of stuff in their house, or even that it may look like a typical person that has a hoarding condition. They have to actually have an emotional difficulty in letting go, like an emotional attachment to the condition. Um, there are conditions that can mimic hoarding. So, one condition could be major depressive disorder. For those of you or for people that do in community work, you might go into somebody's house and wow, it looks like somebody who has a hoarding condition. But if you were to assess this person who simply has depression, you would notice that all they have is depressive symptoms. So it's really their lack of motivation due to the depression that's leading to the accumulation of items. So one of the telltale signs also would be that if you were to like hypothetically offer somebody who was simply depressed but had a quote unquote cluttered house, like a free dumpster, and you were there to do this like work for them for free and give them a bunch of free help for it, they would be like, oh, thank you so much. They would be very appreciative of it if they just had depression. Though if they have like hoarding, they're going to be like, get that away from me. I do not want to see that dumpster at all. It's going to be like a traumatic thing for them. So that's one of the distinguishing things, is that just because somebody has what we may call a cluttered home, it does not necessarily mean that they have a hoarding condition. Really, they have to have that emotional difficulty in getting rid of the stuff, the emotional attachment to the items. Anybody have any questions about that overall? All right. So there are also other conditions that many times co-occur with hoarding. Um, in practice, it's very rare that you're going to see somebody simply with a hoarding condition. So many times they're going to have depression with their hoarding. So they're depressed and they have a hoarding condition. So the depression basically increases the challenge with the hoarding because it makes them more depressed, makes them less likely to want to do stuff. Another one is anxiety. Anxiety can, cause a lot of avoidance. That's another thing that really perpetuates the hoarding, is this concept of the avoidance of getting rid of the items, which then basically says to the person, unintentionally, that wow, I can't handle this, so they keep avoiding it over and over again. So then the anxiety keeps building, building, and building. Another condition that we see, fairly regularly is what we call OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Um, these are people that have like they might have like a obsession about contamination. So they wash their hands like 100, 200 times a day to the point that their hands get raw, or they're missing work because of the issues. So the contamination example is a pretty common one. There's many different types of OCD subtypes that we don't really have a lot of time to go through tonight, but that's kind of one of the main ones. One thing that you're going to see with like somebody who has hoarding and OCD is you're going to see this, what I would call perfectionistic recycling. So they're going to be like, wow, I need to like make sure that my recycling gets recycled in the exact, appropriate, perfect way. For example, I had somebody that I was helping years ago who was like, "Oh, where do I put the white paper versus the yellow paper?" Right? That's how concerned she was. It was like very extreme concern. And she was even contemplating trying to get a tour of the local recycling center itself. And then she was very obsessed with getting like the best vacuum ever, yet you couldn't even barely walk in her home. So that's really, you can see how like some barrier like that could make it really tough to overcome the hoarding challenge. And then another condition that we can see at times is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Somebody has been through, a sexual assault, or they've been robbed by gunpoint, or, they were in war. And not only did they have the trauma, because the trauma itself doesn't mean that you have PTSD, it's the reaction to the trauma. So if you've been through that and you start having like what we call flashbacks, you're seeing stuff like in front of you, even though you're awake. You have nightmares. You're very hyper vigilant. You're always looking over your shoulder all the time. Basically, somebody that has PTSD, they can use their items as a way to kind of cope with the trauma. And that's really what can exacerbate the problem. So, and it can also complicate the treatment, because PTSD treatment is its own protocol versus hoarding. So you got to kind of like mesh them together very eloquently, so that you're not flooding the person emotionally. And then another dynamic that can come into play potentially is somebody that has grief and loss. So they use their items as a way to cope with the grief and loss. It could be a loss of a person. Many times, though, at least in my experience, what I've seen is what we call unrecognized losses. So these are losses that society doesn't acknowledge. One of them is a loss that is of a person over a year ago. So society is going to give the person, a year to get over somebody dying. And then they're going to be like, hey, Frank, get over it, man. What's up? Your mom's been gone for over a year. What's wrong? But the reality is that, there are people that get over losses within 2 months, though there are a lot of people that are going to still have lingering effects of loss over the years. Though what we hope is that, the loss, the feelings of loss are more spread out between times so that it's not so unbearable. Other unrecognized losses is like loss of job, loss of status, loss of a relationship, loss of direction. So they can use their items as a way to try to cope. So the items almost basically become their identity. So when we are like, when people are trying to like do forced cleanouts, the reason they can be traumatic is that the person basically, you're basically taking a part of their identity at that time. So that's kind of a lot of the diagnostic features of hoarding, the co-occurring disorders that can come with it. Does anybody have any questions, comments about that?
A little bit, Wade. So I guess I have a few kind of questions as far as I'm working with someone who is going to therapy, but they're not maybe going to therapy for their hoarding. And
Mhm.
I don't know, is there something that most therapists, if it wasn't divulged, might recognize or see, or does the person usually have to divulge it? And if they do, would the therapist say, like, maybe you need a different therapist, or or I will look for someone else to help? Or I guess I don't know all of the obvious details, but I get the impression that this person is in therapy, but that therapy is not related to hoarding. And I don't know if there's any suggestions that I could make or that the therapist might make, or as far as that. I don't know if that's a great question, but
No, it's a good question. So if I'm understanding correctly, I think what you're basically saying, Emily, is that you have, because of, I know you work in property management, so you have a high suspicion that this person has a hoarding condition.
I am working with them to address hoarding in their home, and
And
they've
the,
shared
or,
with me that yeah, they've just shared some details that I believe there might be seeing a therapist for something else.
so the person acknowledges that they probably have a hoarding or hoarding behaviors.
With me,
Okay. And then you're saying that this person is saying stuff to the point where it seems like the therapist is not treating that directly?
Well, I guess, yeah, and I guess I don't know exactly, but I also don't know if they've even divulged that piece to the therapist.
Yeah. I
Like,
mean,
is
I
that
know,
something you see or?
well, yeah, I mean, I'd like to kind of like try to help you a little bit too here in the process. So have you asked the person directly if they're actually working on that in therapy, or would that be like kind of like inappropriate or out of your comfort zone or?
It wouldn't be that would be something that I could talk with them about, I
Mhm.
suppose, and just kind of get further into that. But I also worry about, if someone is, really likes what they're doing in that process, then I don't necessarily want to take them away from that either. And I would divulge more, but I just remembered we're being recorded, so.
Yeah, no, I understand that dynamic, what we got going on right now. I mean, would you say that this is most likely like in office therapy, like not in home or like
Correct, correct.
telehealth or going to the office?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the realities to answer your original question is that we're kind of like at the mercy of what they tell us and what they don't tell us. So, like, if somebody doesn't want to work on hoarding, like, even if they come to me and they say they have an issue and they really don't want to work on it, they just want to work on other stuff. I, as the therapist, am not going to ethically like force them to work on something that they don't want to work on. Now, there's always a balancing act. Like, if they keep talking about it over and over and they're telling me they don't want to work on it and it's causing issues, I might try to broach it a little bit, like, try to do
Okay.
some motivational interviewing to try to help them get motivated and maybe address the issue. Now, in terms of like, what would the therapist ask? Like, if somebody just came to my office, right, and they were referred for depression and anxiety and there was no mention of hoarding, I wouldn't be assessing for it.
Okay.
Because when we have somebody come in our office and we assess for things, we don't assess for every single possible mental health condition.
Okay.
We just don't have the time to do that because when we're doing our intakes, they're very basic, they're very kind of base level. um so they would actually have to disclose that to us. Now, what are some, like, maybe like, how do I say, like, hints that they might have an issue? Maybe they might say, man, I could barely get into my house the other day, or oh man, my landlord's on my case about my home. Like, that might be prompting questions for me as the clinician to
Okay.
ask and try to further assess whether they have a hoarding condition or not, if they didn't like outright tell me this is what they were looking to get treated for.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, so it can be very gray when it comes to that, um, because we only have so much time to do the assessment, and if they want to do a really in-depth assessment, that's its own discussion on its own. Then they would do like a doctorate level, like, I go in for like a neuropsych for 4 hours and we try to figure out anything and everything you might have type thing. That's its own thing. But
Okay.
from a practical perspective, yeah, if somebody is not going to tell us what it is, or they're not going to tell us that it's hoarding, then all we can do is just go with what they're telling us.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah, and that's kind of where like the whole like stages of change comes into play as well in the whole process. Yeah.
One other thought, really quick, Emily, is as far as therapy goes, you can see more than one therapist depending on insurance. But as long as they're for separate issues, so I wouldn't worry about like taking that person away from a therapist. Like,
Okay.
if it's
Okay. Yeah.
helpful,
Because
they
if
could,
if they really like this, I'm like, oh,
yeah.
okay.
Wade, do you screen for? Sorry, we've got an echo.
Oh, okay. Do I screen for
Do you
hoarding?
screen? Do you screen? Can people disclose on a checklist? Like when you go to the doctor and they ask you about your mom's cancer and heart disease and all this stuff, is hoarding even addressed in a screening process?
Hoarding is not a standard screening question, no.
Do you think it should be someday?
Jennifer, I mean, I think, it's a good question. I have to think about it to give you like my opinion on that.
Right.
I don't think it's like, I mean, it's not common enough to have it as a screening tool, I think. I mean, we're screening for the very like major stuff, depression, anxiety. We're trying to see, do they have manic episodes?
Right.
Do they have psychosis? Do they have trauma? So we're really ruling out the major stuff. And we really direct the assessment by what they're coming in for.
Mhm.
So many times, people aren't always going to tell us everything right away. So a lot of the assessments for these other things they don't share comes up later in the process. And that's kind of, to answer your question, it's a good question. I haven't thought about it, whether it should be a standard assessment. Though the problem is, because of like managed care and time restraints, we don't have all the time to assess for everything.
Right.
Like I'm probably not, and then also we have to do a safety assessment, too. We have to determine base level safety. Are they suicidal or not? So there's a lot that goes on in addition to like giving them their rights and consents, explaining privacy. So yeah, it's hard to throw that in there because that's its own assessment.
Right.
So I think
And I guess
that's
in
where
OT, we're not allowed to diagnose. So
yeah.
like, and we are talking only about function. So even in our outpatient clinic, we are assessing, are you able to, what's the function of your house like? Are you able to do laundry, dishes, basic, meet your own everyday needs? Or do you have service providers that come in for that? And it's just a curiosity. So thank you for answering the question.
Yeah, and I think too, and this is why it's important that the person wants the help, because then if they want the help, then they're going to be honest with us more than they are not, and like sharing about the hoarding. And Jamie brought up, an interesting point, and I think, therapists can go one way or the other. Jamie had talked about like a lot of times you can have two different therapists. For me, like, and everybody's going to operate different. I'm not saying one way is better than the other. For me, I typically don't work with somebody that already has an individual therapist, just because for me, and I'm taking ownership as Wade Crandall here, is that, it can really kind of cause confusing overlap at times. And I think too, like when it comes to like coordination of care, that can be really tough, to get a hold of therapists in a timely manner at times because of how busy they are. And if one person is going through like, let's say trauma therapy, and one person is going through something different, you can kind of like, it can get kind of confusing. And it can also sometimes be considered sometimes a duplication of service. So if it is going to be done that way, the coordination's got to be really good, and really, in my opinion, really good. Now, that being said, if somebody's got like a marriage therapist or like a couples therapist, that's a totally different thing than individual therapy. I do that a lot, where a client will be in like couples therapy and then they're with me in individual therapy. Or, let's say they're in, like a substance use program or something. That's obviously totally different than what I'm doing. So that's kind of my take on it. Now, other therapists would disagree, and that's totally cool. I just think that, it's got to be, in my opinion, it's got to be done in a way that it's really good coordination, and that it's not going to cause issues for the client. And there's a lot of like complicated nuances with that and how that can play out. So that's just my take. But yes, there are many therapists, including at where I work at Nystrom and Associates, that'll have no problems having somebody who has an individual therapist already. So it just depends on the comfort level of the clinician. So, I mean, whatever works and however that goes, that's just kind of how I that's my perspective.
Thank you.
So I went through the diagnostic features. So let me kind of go through, kind of the therapy itself. Jamie, our colleague here, had done a wonderful presentation already about like what it entails. So this will probably be a review for many of you here, at least that are on the the video chat today, but a lot of the base level therapy for hoarding is what we call exposure therapy. So the person has an anxiety to get rid of something. So then what we want to do is we want to expose them to the discomfort of doing that. So what happens is that with anxiety, there's this natural wave to it. So like when somebody like is even thinking about getting rid of something, or they just threw something away that they really wanted, their anxiety is going to peak. So basically what happens is that with people that have a hoarding condition is that many times they either won't put that in the garbage or the recycling or whatever it is, or to the charity. They will basically kind of bail out and go back and like either take it out of the trash or like just not, get rid of it or donate it or whatever it is. And they'll just kind of like keep going into that pattern where they just feel that the high level of anxiety. And then what happens is they don't allow themselves to ride through to the other side. So that's how kind of anxiety is. Acute anxiety in the moment. You're going to rise up, you're going to feel that horrible anxiety, and then it's going to eventually go down. So what we do as therapists in general is that we will why don't you start off and get rid of that one pop bottle? So we'll have them put in the recycling. They're going to get really anxious about it. And then we'll ask them to sit there with it. And then eventually that anxiety will go down. And then the more they do that, the thing that'll happen is what it's called desensitization. Another term for it is habituation, is that over time, the more that they go through the wave of anxiety, the more that they kind of expose themselves to that in a gradual way, is that not only their top level anxiety is going to start decreasing. So instead of like shooting up to this when they deal with the items in their home, it'll be more like this, and then it'll go down. And then another thing too is that the length of the anxiety is going to start shortening ideally. So instead of having an anxiety that's this long in length, it's going to go down in this much in time over time, and it becomes more manageable. There's a lot of repetition to it. So that's what I was talking about before, about how with hoarding therapy, and even any therapy, but particularly hoarding therapy, is there's going to be a lot of work, a lot of repetition. Another thing that we do as well is we try to help people with what we call their self-talk while they're dealing with the exposure therapy. So, trying to be more encouraging to themselves, like, I can do this. Yes, it's hard, and I can do it. Another thing that we do with the hoarding therapy is we will also, in the later stages of the therapy, when they're really doing better, is we'll start doing, we do it throughout, but there's another component called response prevention. So it's actually called ERP, exposure response prevention. So the response prevention part is actually them not bringing in stuff. So there's not only the discomfort of getting rid of stuff, though there's also the discomfort of not bringing in stuff. I got a particular person on my caseload now that has had a hoarding challenge for some time now. She's doing much better at getting rid of stuff, though she still gets stuck on buying stuff. She lives very vicariously through her children, wanting to see them in like a ton of cute clothes, just kind of above and beyond. So we're working on a lot of that stuff to try to help her better with not bringing in stuff. There also can be like, and this was an interesting point that another clinician brought up to me, but I think sometimes, depending on the person, there's almost kind of an addictive component, an addictive behavior to the hoarding as well, especially those that have a shopping addiction. They're spending a bunch of money on their credit card, things like that. So we do a lot of work to help them not spend so much, to help them not bring in stuff. And then eventually, when they're really doing well, what we would then do is we would have them go to like a favorite store and just walk in there, look around, come out, and not shop. So this is later on in the process of the exposure therapy, because as you can imagine, that would probably be one of the most hard things for them to do. And then that's the base level stuff of what we do in terms of like kind of the bread and butter interventions for hoarding, is really a lot of that exposure response prevention. Anybody have any questions about that and how that works or concerns around that? All right. And then depending on the person, as I had talked about before, sometimes they can have trauma and or grief and loss. So there are a lot of times those can be like the top two ones combined. So with the trauma therapy, that's its own conversation. Again, not enough time to go through that tonight. But it's a lot of like grounding, making sure that they can get themselves to the here and the now when they're feeling triggered. We do a lot of work these days with what we call facing perceived threat in a relaxed state, because when people are relaxed, they can't be traumatized. Sounds overly simplistic, but it's hard to practice it. You got to do it over and over again. And there's many different types of trauma therapy too. There's also what we call EMDR. That's something that I'm not trained in, but that's where there's a lot of kind of like, you know, sometimes they'll have like tappers where they have these like joystick things in their hand that kind of like, they'll like vibrate back and forth. And basically it's meant to kind of reprocess your brain. The classic one is the finger back and forth. Like, tell me a bit about that trauma. Now look at my finger back and forth. There's something about the eye movements that basically help to kind of reprocess and kind of reprogram the trauma in the brain. That's its own thing. I'm not an expert on it, but all I'm trying to say is that there's so many different ways to treat trauma, and that's why that can add a complication to the hoarding. And then with grief and loss therapy, that one is not as complicated to treat. A lot of what we do is a lot of psychoeducation about it. So one thing we talk about is the grief loop. So back in the old days when they used to teach the kids about grief and loss, they would teach them about, you know, the 5 stages of grief and loss, which was denial, that some people have that. There can be sadness, which is a huge one. Anger. There also can be what we call bargaining. So like, you know, if only I could have done this, if only I could have done that. And then also there is what we call acceptance, and then things are all better. Well, we still have those 5 stages of grief and loss in play. But what we found out in relatively recent history is that it's not just like this linear A to Z process. It's more like a loop that goes in and out. So, you know, imagine that you're traveling on that highway of life, and then you get to like what we call a cloverleaf ramp. That's basically what the grief loop is. And then you get out of it, and then you're better again. And then here comes another loop, and then another one. So with grief and loss therapy, we're not telling the person that they're never, ever again not going to have sadness over their loved one. But what we're saying is that they're going to go from like a bunch of loops in a row close together in time to then having a more separated out in time. There's many things that we do with that. Again, that's the normalization so that they're not judging themselves about the grief and the loss. We do an exercise, you know, called What's Lost, What's Left, and What's Possible. We have them write out everything they've lost in their lives. And then eventually when they're ready, we have them write out everything that's positive that's left in their life. And then eventually what's possible for the future. There's also a lot of what we call meaning making work, especially in the later stages of the grief and loss therapy. Like, how can you live in honor of the person that passed? Do you want to paint a picture in their honor? Do you want to visit their grave? Do you want to frequent a restaurant that you two went to together? So that adds another dynamic if they're also dealing with hoarding, obviously. So and many times for me, at least as a clinician, I'll kind of like, if they have like 2 different things going on, I'll kind of try to balance them both out. Some clinicians will focus on the more core issues at first, like the grief and loss and or trauma. And then once that's through, then they'll do the hoarding therapy in the context of the theory that if you work on the core stuff, then that'll help you release it. I try to kind of do a balanced approach because I think it's good for them to have exposure therapy to the items while also dealing with the core issues when ready and appropriate. So another thing we do is just basic organizational stuff, not at the level of a professional organizer, but just like encouraging them to, you know, try to move things, you know, no more than one time if possible. That doesn't obviously work out a lot of the times in reality, but that's the ideal. So, you know, either like throw, donate, sell, or, you know, recycle or keep. Because I mean, with hoarding therapy, we're not telling people, you know, that they can't keep anything. That would be, you know, unrealistic. We're not like trying to, you know, shoot for feng shui here. We're basically just, you know, like where do you want to be, you know? And as long as there's no like health issues or any safety issues, you know, we basically, you know, try to really have a partnership with the client, because the reality is that we work for the clients don't work for us. We just make recommendations for them. And then another thing that we try to do, going back to the organizational stuff, is we try to limit or eliminate what we call churning. So churning is basically the art of, you know, let's say you have a pile of newspapers on your kitchen table and your goal is to clear your kitchen table. So you take all the papers off the kitchen table, but then you put them on your bed in the bedroom. So that's churning. So all you're doing is you're taking the problem and putting it from one area to the other area. So we try to really limit that in practice. Does anybody have any questions around that overall? And FYI, this is a very broad overview. When people go into therapy, there's much more nuance to the process itself.
I have one more question. Like a long
Yeah, absolutely.
time ago, I think I don't remember how long ago it was, but
Yeah.
there was some article that came out about the promise of virtual reality and hoarding and therapy. And I'm just wondering, was that just like one article I read, or is there talk about it? Is that a thing people like in the industry have thought about or are using, or was that just like an article that I heard about? You know, is it something that people have even tried or are thinking about trying?
I myself have never heard of that for hoarding, or yeah, definitely, obviously, have never used it. Um, I've heard of it at the VA for the treatment of trauma, where they go through, you know, virtual reality exposure in terms of like military trauma. Jamie
Okay.
might have something to say about it.
In the world of exposure therapy, so not specifically for hoarding disorder only, but there is research being done on virtual reality and using that within exposure therapy. I don't know specifically about hoarding, though. I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, the article just said like it might be useful to have like someone's walking through their favorite store or a store and you know something or putting an item down into a trash or a go pile and like dealing with that feeling that it might be useful. And I just didn't know if that was just some article, if people in the industry are saying maybe we should give this a go. So
It'd be even better to do that in person with the
I suppose.
with the person who hoards and go to some of their trigger stores. So we do that, not in virtual reality.
Okay,
What do
that
you
makes
think
sense.
about harm reduction? What is your overall view of harm reduction as a model?
In the context of what? Because that can be used for you know, substance use, or like.
No,
Have
right.
an
I mean,
example?
in terms of hoarding.
Like, can you? I mean, I know what that means in terms of the concept. Like, what do you mean more specifically?
I guess I'm thinking of reducing shopping versus really getting it under control in terms of maybe the cycles still happen where you still need to have help getting rid of things,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't become independent in that, but that you maintain housing and safe access, and like the uniform inspection checklist basically stays in place.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's ever a housing danger, that's its own thing, right? So I mean, yeah, you're gonna want the person you're helping to keep their housing, right? You don't want anybody to be homeless. So yeah, I mean, if they need to rely on others, absolutely. I mean that can be part of the exposure protocol too, is that okay, maybe you have a safe person with you while you get rid of stuff, you know? So I'm not sure exactly about the harm reduction part. I mean, I maybe what you're trying to say, and correct me if I'm, understanding incorrectly, though, like, yes, they're not getting rid of stuff, but they're in housing danger. Yeah, I'm not gonna like if somebody's in housing danger, right? I'm not gonna like insist that they just do stuff on their own, if that makes sense.
Right. And I would say what I mean is that maybe they never get to be able to do it on their own, but they have IHS or ARMS or somebody that supports them all the time, or a family member or some team member that is trained to work with them on helping them recognize things.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call that harm reduction per se. I
Okay.
would call that more like, professional and personal supports. Though
Okay.
even in that scenario, I would strongly advise the professional and the person that's in their personal life to ask permission before getting rid of the
Always.
stuff.
No,
Yep,
always. No,
exactly.
just supporting them as they
Yeah.
drop things off, supporting them as they recycle.
Yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, as long as, I mean, that's still an exposure, right? Because they're the ones who are making the decision.
Always.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with you on that, Jennifer. Yeah,
Okay.
no, I don't think there's anything wrong with having people help because, like, there are times like, I have somebody on my caseload who's got a lot of physical problems and she does
Right.
need that help. So, no, absolutely. I totally.
I mean, like 90% of my clients don't drive. They have workers to help them do other physical tasks in their life.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of layers to it. And I guess I would have to, I need to improve my question about this harm reduction model and how I'm seeing it in this mode, but I will think about that. Thank you for prompting that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a great discussion. And to go back to Emily about technology and virtual reality, the other thing about technology is just now, telehealth is going to be forever now, basically. So the awesome thing about telehealth is that it's given us in-office therapists. I used to do in-home, but I simply do in-office now as a clinical director. I'm doing the management stuff too. Is that telehealth really allows us to reach people that we've never been able to reach before. So that's a great thing as well, in that we can, we can do like a combination, even if they live closer to us, of in office to, video and stuff, and look in their place if they allow us to do that. So it's another tool that we can use to really properly assess and really thoroughly and accurately assess the situation.
Nice.
Oh, sorry, what now?
I just said nice. That's good.
Oh, thank you. What else? What is I going to talk about here? Oh yeah. So the other thing I was going to bring up is churning. So one of the ultimate examples of churning is storage units. So a loved one might think, oh man, I'm really helping my loved one if I give them a storage unit. Only if it's an emergency situation is that helpful. They're going to get evicted or whatever, but not if it's like, like a moderate level of hoarding. That's one of the last things you want to do as a loved one or as a professional to recommend, is to recommend a storage unit, because all that does is it puts a Band-Aid on the problem. It just increases it, because what happens is that, wow, they got all these items in their storage unit, but then, wow, they got more room in their home to bring in more stuff, right? So they're not really getting to the core issue of the hoarding itself. So that's one thing that I highly caution, is to have storage units. They're really not effective in the long run to treat the hoarding. Also, the modes of therapy, we just talked about that now, is you know, in home versus in office versus actually video chats. I think they're all can have their advantages and disadvantages. I think in office therapy for hoarding has the advantage in that you're not in the distraction of the home and all the chaos and all the items. So it kind of helps to clear their mind to be in an office that's more tidy and neat, if that makes any sense. But being in the home can be more effective in that you have more accurate assessment. You can do more hands-on interventions with the hoarding in terms of the exposure therapy. Though the good thing now is we have the video chat stuff so people can use their cell phone to show you what's going on. The thing with video chat, though, is that here's what I would say in terms of engagement. In person, whether it be in home or in office, is probably the best. I would say the telehealth methods, they're definitely way better than nothing. Video chat would be the second best. And phone, they do have an option for phone. We do that sometimes, you know, like if somebody's video isn't working, but phone is probably not the best at all. You're just not as engaged. It's just the reality, you know, is that when you're on a phone call, you're just not as engaged when somebody's in person. So there's pros and cons to everything when it comes to that. I think a combination of in office and also in home, if possible, is probably the best. Or even if like you're a therapist and, you know, you're not going in the home, if they have like an arms worker or like a case manager that you can coordinate with, they can kind of be the eyes of the in-home. But hopefully they would at least be able to like bring you in their home via, you know, video chat. So I kind of, in an ideal world, you'd kind of do both. But if push comes to shove and they're like far away from your office and it's the telehealth world, and video chat, being able to look in there is really good. One last thing, because I know time is pretty much up now, is that one thing that can really complicate hoarding is if somebody lives with somebody else that has a hoarding condition. So they have a hoarding condition and then another person has the hoarding condition. I got a particular person who is doing better with her own hoarding, though her mother refuses to work on it all. Mother is in pre-contemplation. Mother is, you know, the client has economic restrictions. They can't easily move out of there, but yet the mom doesn't want to do anything about their issues. So that really adds its own complication. It's a tough one. Sometimes it's really thinking outside of the box about their environment, you know, having them make the decision about that. Do they want to eventually move at some point? Are they going to just do it themselves? Maybe, you know, there's a lot of like what we call radical acceptance, though. Yeah, that's the overview of how I treat hoarding, how other people have treated hoarding, things to think about before even going into therapy for hoarding. And yeah, does anybody have any questions before we end this presentation? All right. Well, thanks everybody for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wade.
All right.
Thank
Have a
you,
good
Wade.
evening.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Oh, wait, Jackie, you got your hand up. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, you know, you had talked about other comorbidities. Wade, how much would you say that ADD or ADHD, you know, compounds the hoarding behavior?
Yeah, I don't have any studies to reference directly, Jackie, when it comes to that. I mean, just from, I guess, intuitive sense, and maybe Jamie has some things to offer in this as well, is that I think whenever somebody is dealing with a condition where their attention can be problematic, I think that can be hard to have the attention to go through the items. That's just my intuitive sense. Jamie, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think they can. I don't have like the numbers or anything. They definitely can be comorbid, and I think one of the big things with hoarding disorder and ADHD is the overlap with the like disorganization, trouble with executive functioning. So we do like talk about some of those executive functioning skills. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but.
Well, I think, you mentioned that you can sometimes you can look like major depressive disorder, or it can look like hoarding, and sort of your tell on that. What is there a tell in relation to, is it severe ADHD and that dysregulation in the prefrontal cortex, or is it truly, no, it's full blown, you just OCD or, hoarding behavior, or is it really a dog chasing its tail? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jackie, I think it goes back to the emotional attachment to the items. So
Okay.
if they had ADHD and no emotional attachment to the items, they're probably going to be like, if you give them like a free dumpster or like a free cleaning crew, they'll probably be like, hey, thanks a lot. But if you were to offer that to somebody who truly has a hoarding condition, they're going to be like, get that away from me, with some
Sure.
choice words probably, added on top of that. So, yeah, that would be the way that I would distinguish, I guess, in terms of like if it was just one or the other versus like working together.
And would you say that if you went that route, let's say it leans more towards the ADHD, would your therapeutic approach be somewhat similar?
Well, for me personally, I'm not really an ADHD like behavioral CBT expert. It's not one of my strongest suits. What I might do is refer them, like for us at Nystrom and Associates, we have a policy where we really don't, we're not told that we can't do it, but we really kind of try to have them get testing to confirm they have ADHD, because ADHD can mimic anxiety, it can mimic other things. So we don't just usually, everybody's different, but usually it's not best practice just to diagnose it off a checklist. We try to get like really specific testing. So if they meet criteria through that specific testing, many times the person doing the assessment will have recommendations at the end of the reports. And then that may include visiting a psychiatrist for like a medication that could help counter like Adderall or whatever they have for that, as I'm not a medication expert. But yeah, the best that I've been able to do is like, put a timer on for 15 minutes, let it go off. Are you still paying attention? Try to recenter them or something like that, though it's not my strongest suit, to be honest. And
Sure.
in terms of me as a therapist specifically.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Okay, everybody. Well, have a great evening, and yeah, I'll see you around some other time.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank
Wade.
you.
Thanks.
I'm
Bye.
gonna stop the recording.
All right. See ya.